In the 2nd century, Aelius Aristides wrote of Rome. About her, not only is it impossible to speak properly, but it is impossible even to see her properly. In truth, it requires some all-seeing Argos, or rather the all-seeing God who dwells in the city. For beholding so many hills occupied by buildings on plains, or so many meadows completely urbanized, or so much land brought under the name of one city, who could survey her accurately, and from what point of observation? I think that's a contemporary problem that we're having today. How do we look at the past and past environments? I want to talk about 3 obvious contemporary approaches to seeing antiquity, ancient Rome and other cities. The first one revolves around mapping. Our era has been called the golden age of mapping. Even just 5-6 years ago, I would give my students a blank map of the Mediterranean and say, put Rome and Paris there, and I'd get half of them in the middle of the Mediterranean. Geographical information now is rampant and accessible, but the mapping of ancient cities is still extremely difficult. Only one known map of ancient Rome exists. The Forma Orbis Romae of the early 3rd century was carved in marble, and here are all the pieces. Over 1,000 pieces remain, and if you put them together, you see the gray is showing where the pieces are, and the yellow showing what the entire city is. Not exactly a very useful map for us. The map itself is huge. It measures approximately 13 meters in height and 18 meters in width. And we have new technologies that are analyzing this. A team at Stanford used puzzle theory and other techniques to try to put these pieces together with some success. But we still are trying to figure out how new technologies and new brains configured for the 21st century inform geospatial understanding of the past. This golden age of mapping is being accompanied by a reinvigoration of narrative. That first image that went too fast is Jennifer Egan's new novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, which is called the first novel to be structured like a Facebook page. It moves through and across time and space, both real and digital. This image is showing you a 3D Rome built by a Flickr community using algorithms which take all of the photographs and mash them together to make a 3D image. This is telling a story, but it's a story about our contemporary society. It's not a story about the Roman background for building this model. After all, what is the plot here? Today, every picture or map tells a story, and every story creates not just a pictorial map, but a mental map that we carry with us. This third point is that we're in a geotemporal era in which information occupies time and space. This is similar to the Putinger map of, this is a 12th or 13th century copy of an earlier Roman map. Again, they like things big. This one's about 7 meters long, which is not showing a geographical layout, but a conceptual layout for the topography. After all, you didn't really need to know the geography to move from place to place. You needed to know the roads and where they went and where were the locations of the various hotels along the way to stay. Well, let me start out by situating myself. I'm an architectural historian. Architecture is a subject that is by nature complex and multimodal. One sees, experiences architecture with all the senses. It evolves over time. It impacts large environments, culture, economics, politics. As Le Corbusier noted, an understanding of architecture requires the foot that walks, the head that turns, the eye that sees. Architecture, then, is apprehended by both the body and the eye in motion. So let's go back to that marble map that we saw the pieces of, and we saw a two-dimensional version of. And here's a fragment, and I want you to see a reconstruction of how it was displayed. Huge map that really could not be used, although it's full of detail. It was high above an average person, and with no electric lighting, and no glasses, very difficult to read. It was really more of a propaganda statement. So I've been long frustrated with teaching about historical architecture using two-dimensional slides. They flatten the space, they confuse the scale, they deny the multi-century embodied aspects. For the modern period, we can visit the buildings, we can interview the users, we can document their evolution. We don't have that luxury for ancient environments. My motivation for involvement with historical simulations is to show that architecture is multidimensional. I'm interested in how you move through it, or as the Roman architectural historian Bill MacDonald said, I want to rub my shoulder against a building. I also am concerned with movement in time, because buildings aren't all the same. They live for a long time. So periodization is very useful for teaching and understanding, but it's not like somebody went to sleep one day in the Republic and woke up and said, oh, today must be the Empire. So I like to see more nuanced understanding of environments rather than saying this is Roman, saying at least there's the Augustan phase, the late imperial phase, and so on. And also to realize that buildings changed over time, and also our interpretations of them evolve over time. Here I'm showing you alternate reconstructions of the facade of the Curia. I think it's useful to think of buildings not just as unitary, built at the moment of the architect's conception, but that they are constantly changing, and that there's something that we can experiment on making alternative, finding solutions for them. For antiquity, this is the kind of reconstructions that we've had. It's a very nicely done drawing. It's very useful. But what's missing? Well, there's a lot of things missing. Besides people and sound, the Romans didn't levitate, as far as I know, so they didn't have this view. We don't have the aging of the materials. We don't have the dirt. We don't have the sounds. We don't have the colors, even the colors. And just to give you a sense of the difference in how we look at antiquity, I wanted to show you a recent reconstruction of the Augustus of Prima Porta with the original color. And while I'm showing you Augustus here with his lipstick on, I want to also emphasize that the voices that we have about the environments of the past tend to be elite, few, and overwhelmingly male. So today what I thought I'd do is to present some projects, sort of a mini history of the work we've done at UCLA and showcase 3 case studies. I'm not going to talk about technological specifics, but really more about research issues. And since you're at this lecture, you already sort of have bought into the digital world, I want to move beyond the phase of boosterism, saying, yeah, everything's great, and tell you some of the problems, show you some of the warts that we have. And one of the big warts here is that I'm showing you slides, two-dimensional, with all those problems I mentioned. I'll show you a little interactivity if the gods of technology are willing, but I hope you'll visit us at UCLA and see some of our models in our visualization portal. Well, our foundational steps were not modest. Ancient Rome was not built in a day, nor has been our virtual versions. The earliest experiments were involving reconstruction, and this projector is a little dark, so you may not have noticed that this room from the house of Augustus was filled in. The fragments were put together here. A lot of this work began in the School of Architecture for very logical reasons, not only because we had the students and the faculty who knew about architecture and structure and form, but also because we were using computers at an earlier phase than other departments. In 1997, we worked with the Getty Museum to design a real-time model of Trajan's Forum. This was built by the urban simulation team at UCLA. And this model was really quite an early experiment with this. And the problem occurred that the Getty thought they were hiring us as a job shop, and we, for some silly reason, thought we were adding intellectual content. And we worked with Jim Packer from Northwestern, trying to come up with the appropriate designs and components. And unfortunately, since we were dealing with two institutions with lawyers on staff, when it came to showing this model and who owned the model, we ended up spending probably 3 times as much on lawyers' fees as on the project itself. And it got to the point where I could literally not show this image without calling up Marianne True of the Getty and saying, I'm giving a lecture, can I show the model? So it was at an early stage when people didn't know who owned what, how does this work, how does collaboration work, if you pay the bill, do you own it, or if you are the tech person, do you own it, if you're the scholar, do you own it? These were very early questions. Shortly after, my colleague Bernie Fisher and I established the Cultural VR Lab, and we did it by simply saying one day, we've made a lab, and it's called the Cultural Virtual Reality Lab. The university didn't say anything, so we kept going. Our project was the Rome Reborn model. We said, well, let's build all of ancient Rome from around 800 BC to 800 AD. That would be easy. Well, we couldn't quite find a sugar daddy or a sugar mama to go for that. But let me tell you some of our operating principles that we started with. For me, it was really important that we be as scientifically, well, for both of us, be scientifically accurate. Each model had a scientific team of experts from around the world who collaborated and vetted the models. So we documented all of the decisions that were made and so forth. We decided early on that we would use these as knowledge representations. We weren't going to be hyper-realistic, but really show what was known about the Arch of Septimius Severus in the late 1990s, rather than try to make it as realistic as possible. We also placed, we decided to focus on the Roman Forum because the original site where you go today is very hard to understand. Drawings like that line drawing you just saw a second ago did not convey the complexity of the place. And so we were trying to bring back an understanding of this space really in 4 dimensions, because we made the decision to go with real-time modeling, which means in the original model, you can move through it and go anywhere you want to go. You can fly, you can go through walls, you can go up high or low, and it regenerates the image. Problem is, here's a knowledge representation, and it's generated in every 30 frames a second. Just about that time, Gladiator came out. Now, it would take probably about 2 weeks to render that one image, and they used computer farms in those days. So very different results, because we were doing it in real time, and these kinds of images had a lot more money and a lot more firepower, but it was something that caused a reaction to our models, which people, of course, said, there's no sound, where are the flags, where's all the shadows, where's Russell Crowe? So we were a bit at a disadvantage at that time. Our models ran on very large computers in those days. I had many backaches from carrying around these shuttles to show the models anywhere. And we also show them in our visualization portal. It's a very Star Trek-y place with a 22-foot curved screen. You can show it in 3D, as you see those people with their 3D glasses there. It has very sensitive sound system. But that was terrific. We've had concerts in there in Romanesque churches and so forth. But it's not everybody can come to LA and come and see this. We managed to get access to this portal, which was built by the medical school because they have 3D models of the heart and cells and so forth. They'd pay for that. Well, actually, the university had paid for it, the university as a whole, but only the scientists were using it. So we became the token for the humanities to use this facility. In all our models, we soon realized that you couldn't just hire a student from computer sciences to do a model. You really needed somebody who understood architecture and history, and now all of our models are done by students with that kind of background. So what I like about the models, and I hope you'll visit some of our websites because they're being projected here through, they're a little darker here. Now we can footnote a building. It's very hard to document a building. When you move through a structure, you can't have Post-its everywhere explaining everything. So here now we have very complex metadata that could be accessed and tell you not only about the building and all of the ancient sources and so forth, but also about who modeled it and based on what kind of information. At first I had these two ideas that both turned out to be false. One was I thought, all the students who have grown up doing gaming are going to be able to just model through, just move through these models very easily. And I thought all the scholars who had studied the Roman Forum for decades, they'd be able to move through it. No. So we ended up making a pop-up navigator that shows on the red dot where you are and what direction you're looking at. And incidentally, that was the same finding that the U.S. military found when they made 3D models of bin Laden's caves, that the soldiers needed maps in order to navigate because they couldn't navigate really in these three-dimensional environments. To help with navigation, we have used localized sound, putting a sound in a particular location, so when you get closer to it, the sound gets louder. And this really helps you understand the space much better. I have a classicist colleague who came, who'd been using the models in his teaching, and I said, come, we've got sound now. And he came, and we went through it, and he said, yeah, now I see it better. So sound really does help. Of course, we want the buildings to be complete in their 3 dimensions, but we don't have the data for everything. In the metadata, we have documented what parts are based on archaeological evidence at one extreme and are hypothetical at the other extreme. But it's very hard to show that in the models. We've experimented with veracity sliders. This is something USC came up with, a reliability coding and so forth. That hasn't become standardized yet, but we're still experimenting. Our product was the Digital Roman Forum, which was launched in 2003. It's an aggregation of knowledge, so I hope you'll go there. If you've picked up a flyer, you'll have the website there. It's presents the information in the normal ways, chronologically and alphabetically, and but also we really wanted people to come to the information spatially and temporally. So the first place you go to on here is a time map that allows you to see adjacencies and to jump from one building to another in terms of their spatial relationships. And let's see if I have this on here. And we also have a timeline. This is one of the most popular aspects of this that would show you the parts that evolved over time, so you could see how the forum changed. Sorry, I have to go back and forth here. This shows on the website, I'm sorry, it's very dark there, but this then and now image. Let me see if I can get that up a little higher. Which allows you to see what a space looks like today in the bottom, and what it looked like at June 21st at 8 a.m. in 400 AD. And you can change the time of day to see how the lighting changed. And a factor that's very important for understanding past environments where artificial lighting was limited. This is the Basilica Aemilia. You saw the plan. Herbert Bauer worked on this for many years and did a very nice reconstruction. But he did his reconstruction by making plan of the ground floor and the second floor and doing the facade. He didn't do a 3-dimensional rendering. And when we did it in 3 dimensions based on his findings, we found that there were sections that you couldn't reach to. The staircase didn't fit where he had it. It ended at a blank wall, and so on. It's because he hadn't put it together in 3 dimensions. So I think this process of making the models is very informative and really gives us a lot of information. This kind of work is, of course, collaborative. We now have new research paradigms where it's the process that results in findings, that the image is not something that you slap together at the end of after you've done all your research. It's part of the knowledge production. And because you're working with collaborators, all sorts of interesting things come up, not only the prejudices of each discipline, but also new ways of thinking. I work on a regular basis with computer scientists, acoustic engineers, musicians, structural engineers, architects, designers, theater people, and so forth. And it's really very, very rewarding, although it's sometimes we use the same words to mean very different things. I must say, though, that across the board, there's still a gender issue. Working on a model, it's always assumed that the men do the technology and the women do the humanities. Now, we're doing more and more with experimentation, and I'm sorry this is dark here, but maybe that's the point. We did some lighting studies. This is Cubiculum 16 by Phil Stinson for his master's degree, and he studied the exact lumens of a Roman oil lamp, even tried to figure out what kind of, how the oil burnt and whether it flickered and so forth, to show the lighting here. So we now are doing more with experimentation in the same way that scientists do. A problem for us also is that research is open-ended, that you can keep working on this endlessly, that it changes. You all probably have had the experience of going to a website and then a month later that website's gone or it's changed or so on, which really is creating this discomfort with this indeterminacy without having a final product of a single book that you can say, okay, I'm done with that project, let it go. In 2004, my colleague Bernie Fischer left. Same year, Google acquired Keyhole's Earth Viewer 3D, and the next year rolled out Google Earth. Well, Bernie and I had an amicable divorce. We both kept the models and went on in different directions. This is our version of Google Earth that's in ancient Rome 3D, which you can access on the web, but it does take a long time to download, as you can imagine, with over 5,000 buildings, but at least it provides a broader access. This was then commercialized by UCLA and Bernie on his way out, an issue which I can tell you about over drinks sometime, because it again involved a lot of lawyers. To make that model, we used procedural modeling where you make rules about how many apartment buildings there were, how many baths, and so on, which you're seeing here. And here's the Google Earth in 3D, which links to a database that's been created at the University of Virginia. The commercialized view is shown in a virtual theater right next to the Colosseum. This is something I personally have a little problem with because I think you should be looking at the actual thing rather than being in a theater, although the theater has air conditioning, so you plus and minus. But commercializing brings its own set of problems, as you can imagine. Do you want your models on mugs and T-shirts? And well, don't have trouble with that, but it gets, the more and more problematic. And negotiating the contract, again, very problematic. Who owns the model? Who owns the data? Who gets what? If it's licensed to a commercial firm, can they keep you from using it in an educational product? If it's a academic book, well, if the book's sold, that's commercial, and so it gets very, very, very complicated. And this is the latest version that Bernie and his team have done to try to get away from those legal problems by making a whole new model. And this is a very attractive model which suffers the same problem that we've had with many of our models. It's just too pretty. It's clean, it's nice, it's very unlike the series Rome, which you might have seen on HBO, which really conveys more the dirt and aging and so forth. 2004, we established the new Experiential Technologies Center etc., because we wanted to emphasize all the other things. It's established in the School of the Arts and Architecture. It has a real place, and it's part of institution building, which is what I've really been involved in for the last few years, trying to establish digital efforts in the humanities as valid and accepted within the university context. We've done a whole series of conferences on digital work. We've held international online seminars in Second Life. Here's one. We've written white papers about digital humanities. We have a digital humanities manifesto, which is online, and I hope you'll look at. And really promoted a lot of interdisciplinary work across the humanities and beyond. I can tell you later about our work with neurobiology making a meth apartment in Los Angeles. All of my colleagues, we all came together and tried to think about our current interests, and they seem to coalesce around mapping, really around geospatial or geotemporal issues. So with the funding from the Keck, we've developed the Digital Cultural Mapping Program, which is now under consideration to be a minor, to get a minor in digital humanities. And we have really established an institution whose acronym is longer than any one, well, maybe not in the military, but it's the Institute for Digital Research and Education, Humanities, Arts, and Architecture, Social, and Information Sciences. The purpose being to be inclusive and to leave nobody out and let everybody feel that they have a place, because calling something the Humanities Institutes creates a lot of territorial problems. So let me show you these case studies really quickly. In 1877, British adventurer Amelia Edwards wandered through the famous hypostyle hall at Karnak and exclaimed, "The pyramids may be more stupendous and the Parthenon more beautiful, yet in nobility of conception, in vastness of detail, in mystery of the highest order, the hypostyle hall at Karnak surpasses them all. It is without reservation the noblest architectural work ever designed and executed by human hands." The structure is included in every textbook of architectural history, but this is what you see. Something usually in black and white, something that shows it in its latest phase. Yet this was a complex. It's 2 times the size of the mall in Washington, D.C. Huge complex, built on for over 2,000 years. Very hard to grasp. The data is obscure. It's published in out-of-the-way French places. It's fragmented. The size is gigantic. It underwent many, many alterations and changes. And of course, the Egyptian style makes it seem like there's a uniformity that really there are some subtleties about. So we established Digital Karnak, and if we have time at the end, maybe I'll play some more with this. Let me see if I can get us to go. This was funded by the NEH, and the purpose was to provide a learning platform for students. So for this, we made videos, animations, 3D model, took thousands of photographs. We wrote general essays about the various features. We looked at processions and so forth. But it's all there organized primarily spatially and temporally, and it's designed for people to explore. It's an exploratorium. It's not for a teacher to come and, push a button on the computer and then go outside and have a cigarette. Can you hear me if I just talk like this? Okay. So it's on Google Earth. You can go look at it. If you go to a particular building and click on it, you get the information about it. Just to give you a sense, if this will cooperate. There's a short essay on it. You can then link back to our website, and it'll show you all of the information. This has 9 renderings, 220 photographs, no archival images or videos on this one, but you get a sense for how many things there are. Another problem we find in these online sites is there are very few places that vet them. So when you're coming up for your promotion, that doesn't work so well in an academic context because they say, well, who reviewed it? Well, some tech place reviewed it and talked about the code, which isn't very good if you're a humanist. And also, the reviews we do get don't really understand the parameters that exist in the digital world. So we had somebody, like this has 220 photographs, and one of the reviews said, well, those photographs were all taken on one day. You should have come back in the winter and taken it on Thursday of December or something. We had enough money to send one person there and do a photo blast and come back. And our goal also was not to provide everything. We don't have sound, and this drove a lot of people crazy who would put on those movies, those little animations, and there's no sound. And they said, well, I got many, many emails about people wanting to be spoon-fed, when what we want people to do is really go through and look at everything. So I'd encourage you to go and play with it on your own. It's on that handout. It's also linked to bigger initiatives. This is the UEE, the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, which is done by my colleague Willeke Wendrip with help from Elaine Sullivan, who both also were co-PIs on the Karnak project. This is trying to give, again, some more legitimacy to the models because it's now linked to an encyclopedia and text and so forth. But still, this question about giving credit is very, very complex and is causing quite a bit of trauma in the academic world. In fact, one of my colleagues who was very excited. She got a $250,000 grant to do a digital project, and she told the chair of her department, and he said, oh, well, that's nice, but when are you going to do your real research? So there's still that kind of prejudice. The second case study I want to show you is one that's probably going to go live online in about a month. This is a collaborative project with Gregor Callas from the University of Tennessee. Oh, wait, wrong one, sorry. This is a collaborative project I did with Chris Johansson of the Classics Department. And this was for the first digital edition of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, which we were very pleased to work on. And we were looking at the Roman processions both in the Republic and in the High Empire to see what was the symbiotic relationship between the forum and this processional event. Again, we weren't so concerned with hyper-realism, but more with having an accurate sense. So especially for the archaic early period where we know where the buildings were, but we don't really know what they looked like, we decided to represent that graphically with these sort of massing models rather than with high detail. We explored sight lines, crowd control, soundscape sequences. Chris estimated 26,000 people could fit into the Roman Forum. Of course, we're facing these problems of universalism, associating 21st century reactions to a past era. But we're trying to think about the period I and what it would have been like to be in this space. And here's a description by Dio of sitting in the forum and listening to a eulogy. And he says, "We shouted our approval many times in the course of his address, now praising and lamenting the deceased. But our shouts were the loudest when he ended." To do this, we really weren't trying to be realistic. We were using the models as experiments and really just marking them up and trying to experiment through markups. We wanted to understand sight lines. Those are perhaps the easiest things to do. Here we're looking at the visual connections between the forum, the Arch of Septimius, and the Trajan's Column. But we had a problem with the journal people. This was their first journal. They decided sort of midstream that they wanted to have a print version and the digital version be identical, which kind of, if it had been all born digital, which is what we'd written it for, then we had to rewrite it for the hybrid Frankenstein. We had no control over the size of the images, which were too small. Digital projects have a lot of downriver problems. And by that I mean things that when you do a book, you publish it, put it on the shelf, basta. You don't have to think anymore. With digital projects, that's not the case. I forgot I was going to mention at this point that an outgrowth of that research on the funerals led to me thinking about construction traffic, and this is a study of a construction tower in front of that arch. And the soundscapes. Let's see if I can get this to work. And he's not going to talk for us. Those of you who were here early saw him performing, but he's recalcitrant. This is what I was going to show you. This is how it looked from the JSH. Then Google Earth changed its terrain model, and this is what you get now. So there's a lot of downstream problems that you can't anticipate. When Firefox upgrades, suddenly everything you have online doesn't work anymore. So there's a lot of ongoing maintenance that previously we never had to think about. So we started, a whole team started really developing this Hypercities project. This was begun by Todd Presner when he was at Stanford and now at UCLA, which is a digital research and learning platform. Again, I hope you'll go play with it. But it's a way for us to try to integrate more the text and the argument and the 3D geo-browser. So you could have them all linked together rather than having really tiny little images in the JSAH version, and also so that we could have a little bit more control. Oops. And the last case study, as I started to say, is with Gregor Callas from University of Tennessee. This was a NEH program that only lasted 1 year to bring young scholars from institutions without digital centers to a digital center to work on producing and learning digitally with modeling and other approaches. So we're using this project to try to bring together the two warring sides in the field of classics, the text people and the object people, by studying the statues, the texts in the Roman Forum and in the late antique period, precisely around the procession of Honorius in 404, and try to link them all together in a 3D environment. So just as in these three texts, you see how the words get repeated and linked. The same thing happened in 3D in the forum, where the various words get repeated in sequence. Sometimes even the same statue gets repeated over and over, and then there are linkages of sight lines and view sheds, not only of human observers, but also of the sculptures. And this is going to go live soon. I don't have time to show you it on Hypercities right now, but it's tracing that purple line is the March of Honorius, and here's a reconstruction of the forum, trying to understand the interaction between text and sculptures and art and this moving procession. Like all projects, this one raised new questions, like which way do sculptures face? Do you see the rear end of the horse or the front end of the horse? How do you represent the existence of a statue when you don't know how big it was? You maybe have a picture on a coin this big. How did things work in sequence if you can't really understand the scale, and so on? We also worked quite a bit with epidocs for textual markup in this project here. And the challenge was how to show 3D sculptures, which take up a lot of computer power. In all of these projects, we suffer from the more factor, or the more syndrome. More. More sound, more light, more figures, more color, more people, all of that. At a lecture on multisensory reactions up in Canada not long ago, I was asked, how far will you go? Now, I hadn't been asked that since I was 16, but it's worth considering. And noting how the functional limits of technology really do skew our findings, and we haven't quite meshed the reviewing side and the technology side. What are the limits the technology puts on you? What are the limits the funding puts on you because the technology is expensive? And what are the limits your research goals put on you? 15 years ago, any digital model was considered scientifically accurate simply because it was made on a computer. Today, that's no longer the case. I want to end by talking about new roles for creators. The idea of the lonely scholar Jerome in his study is no longer appropriate. We now work collaboratively, not as individuals. We have to come to grips with that. In the sciences, they have accepted the fact that, as my vice chancellor told me the other day, of collaboration. He says, yeah, I'm in the sciences, and my latest article had 1,428 collaborators, and they're all listed, which already makes the article quite long. But the person who's listed first gets all the credit. Humanists, I'm not comfortable with that. So how do we break it down when it's not that one person is technology and one person is the academic? We work collaboratively. So we need to redefine our roles and really educate people in academia who are making promotion decisions on how to evaluate these things. We also have to think about parenting these projects. I can't put it on a shelf and forget it. I have to keep going back and making sure it's functional. We also have to parent the profession to be part of this publication shift and of maintenance. We're working closely with the library to ensure not just that the digital file is there, but that the digital file is workable, because even in 2 years, the technology has changed. So you have to take that code and make sure it's going to work on the next version down. We have to be part of the evaluation and really concerned about training young people so that they will get into this field. We also need new roles for readers. The experiential analytics of websites and interactive models is very different from reading a book. And frankly, kids' brains are wired differently. They're used to multitasking and skimming rather than reading a book from cover to cover. How then do we train them to read and analyze 3D models? How do we bring in those extras, the ETCs, the sensory aspects, the mood? And above all, how do we contextualize this information in culture? What is meant by an architectural space or sequence or speed of movement in a particular period? That quote I read you at the beginning by Le Corbusier about architecture is based on the head that moves, the eye that turns, the foot that moves, is quoted very often, but never in its full context, where he continues, Arab architecture teaches us a valuable lesson. It is best appreciated on foot. Walking, you have to walk through a building with a changing viewpoint to see the articulation of the building deployed. It is the opposite to that of Baroque architecture, which is conceived on paper around the fixed vertical axis. I prefer the teachings of Arab architecture. Not a quote you're going to hear often these days. And I'll end by saying that digital reconstructions are not substitutes for the materiality of the building. They still privilege the eye. You don't get a sense of tactility, of heat, of those sort of intangible things that you get when you're actually standing in the Basilica of Maxentius. Digital modeling today is expanding our research, but models are not the real thing. We will never know 100% what it was like to walk through the Roman Forum. I agree with Aeles Aristides that we will never be able to see or survey ancient Rome accurately, but I would argue with him about speaking properly. By weaving stories about the past with words, environments, movements, sounds, and other senses, we occupy an enhanced point of observation and speak, if not necessarily accurately, at least more clearly. Thank you.
We do have time for questions, and if you're ready to take some questions. Sure. There's a roaming microphone, so identify yourself if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll get a mic to you. Back, again.
My question to you in this Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology is this. A child comes home from school and asks her mother, Mommy, how do you spell read? But Mommy, listen to this. If you do not tell me how to spell read, I will resurrect, bring back the dead, all the people who ever died in their actual architectural environment. If you were in the shoes of this mother, what would you do? Choice number one, spell the word breathe, or face her trying to resurrect the dead. And if you made the second choice, would you have actually defined breathe instead of telling her how to spell it?
I think I would have defined read and say that in my mind you read not just words, you read everything in the world. That has become a word that we use to mean understand. And so I think that being in a place is a way of reading just as much as looking at letters. So I'd try to make it a more complicated answer, but one that a 5-year-old could understand.
Another question?
Well, I would say I probably would do it through an example and take a book and say, let's read a child's book. That's one way of reading. Let's walk through the house and tell me what you understand. And let's listen to some music and tell me what you understand. And there's a difference between understanding and the literalness of the word, of looking at words in textual form.
Hello, my question is sort of around the presentation of the visual models themselves. I mean, I can imagine this work almost being performance art on some level, where there's an interaction with the software. What do you suggest for artists and for content creators who are making this type of work in terms of presenting the work on the web or in person, some of those challenges?
Yeah. One of the most effective things we ever had, we also have a model of Santiago de Compostela's Romanesque church, and we had a concert there where we had this big screen showing the building, and in another room were singers singing music 12th century music that had been found at the site. And then at one point, when the model was the correct scale on the screen, they came in process and kept singing. And we actually were going to have the sound be re-engineered for the acoustics of the church, but we found it was too loud and too hard to understand, which is what it was in the 12th century. But for our audience, we had to change it. So I think those kinds of human interactions are very effective, and we work with the theater group and try to get them to interact. Not so easy to get that kind of interactivity online at this moment. There isn't a high enough bandwidth to do that. We've also experimented with green screens in film studios, but very costly. So I think there's a lot to be done with motion capture in particular.
I just finished a VR series in Rome. I spent the last 6 years there. And I did a VR of the Sistine Chapel, which is available on the back of the website. Someone has commented there is no substitute for being there. And I took exception because, one, when you're there with the other 5,000 people, you can't lie down on the floor and see the ceiling. I'm an artist, so my intent was to share the ceiling close up with people by themselves and to peruse that. That's why this excites me, because you can peruse the forum, and I don't care how many times you've been there, you can't see it this way and really understand the way you put it. So you say there's no substitute for being there, but in your case, you can't be there.
Well, that's right. You can't be there. But also, I think you need both. They're not mutually exclusive. To be in Rome is a very different thing than being in LA. So I think just having the sense of what a climate is like and so on, even if it's 20th century rather than 2nd century, is important. And also you see the remains and their tangibility. But that said, these models are so evocative. One of the colleague who did the church I was telling you about, he had a group from a seminary come in, and at one point they were showing the altar and playing the music and all of this, and one of the monks went over in the corner and kneeled down and prayed, because for him it seemed like it was the church. And that was a very moving kind of experience, to see that these can have that kind of impact. Lothar?
It's always wonderful and exciting to see what you and the institution are doing. Okay, I can tell the wrong. In that wide visual spectrum between multisensory, hyperrealism, and ultimate perfection on the one side, and blatant imperfection on the other side, wire mods, mass mods, and so forth, where is your personal preference? Where do you see the future? And what, as an additional question, do you think about this rather interesting combination that the Sombra and Vivenza in Rome has done recently to combine ultimate realism, the real thing, on one side, with laser beam wire models incorporated.
Yeah. First of all, I think we need a whole range. We need to see the range. Too often with visual images, somebody would do a reconstruction, and then you'd see that reconstruction in books for the next 40 years. So if you have many, then you can choose what is appropriate for your particular needs. That sort of solution that we've had of saying that it's a knowledge representation, it's showing what we know now, is useful in some ways and not useful in other ways. But I find it at least honest, a little more honest, because you're saying this is how we now interpret it today, not saying this is how it was. I think those projections onto extant buildings, whether it's of color as at the Arapacis or the other projects that you mentioned, those are extremely effective and very useful. They are also very hard to gauge from a scholarly standpoint. So you don't have this kind of documentary evidence that you have in these, where you can go and look at the metadata. So that's the problem that I find with those.
I have a little bit of a tangential question, which is, I very much would like to have, just bought a new computer, I'd like to have architectural software on my computer, but what I want costs $3,000 or something. And there's kind of a split in this world. Sometimes if you're at a university, you get that very software. Maybe the maker will let you use it at a university to promote people learning, so that there will be demand later, commercial. And I'm wondering, on these projects, is there some hope that we will have a lot of open source tools that ordinary people will be able to use? Because when you do use open source, usually you can fit it in your budget, but otherwise you really can't if you're an individual. And to some sense, there's a feeling that individuals are benefiting a lot from sharing computers and walking around.
I got the answer for you. We make these models very big, very dense. They now will run on a laptop, but you have to have a lot of memory and a good graphics card. So we have a grant this year to make an open source software that will, if you have the memory and capabilities on your computer, you'll be able to run them at home. But in order for us to have them online, we have to decimate them. It sounds like you have a ray gun and shoot them. We decimate them and make them smaller, and we often use SketchUp, which is free on Google Earth. So a lot of this that you're seeing here in Karnak is a SketchUp version of a much larger model. So that's free.
I had a question, Diane, if I can
Jim.
about the relationship between sight and sound in these models, because when you're talking about the digital Karnak project, you mentioned that there were complaints from the peanut gallery that there was no soundtrack, but there you were not trying to work with sound, but to offer kind of a purely visual experience. But then with the church that you mentioned and the navigational noises in the Rome Reborn, and at other times in the high-tech sound system in the portal, in the visualization portal, all of this suggests that there's actually a lot of attention to the acoustics, and when we think that acoustic information is spatial information, it could be important. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could just talk more about how you fit together the acoustic and the visual, and who does that work. As an architectural historian, is one trained to understand acoustics?
Yeah. Usually we bring in an acoustic engineer to talk about that, but there is software that will tell you if you have a hard surface on 4 walls, how the sound is going to be. If one's wall's wood, it changes, and so forth. So you can run a program through it. The hardest part, I think, is really getting what sound are you going to put in there. Lisa Schneider, who works with our lab, modeled the Temple Mount for a display on the site, and she spent weeks trying to get the right sound for the right kind of chicken that existed in that period. So it's hard to know what the right sounds are. I mean, in some instances we have the music, but for antiquity, it's very difficult. So we do a lot of what we call hypothetical experiments. But also, I think I was showing hypercities where you have the text and the model and all of that, and I think we should have somebody reading the text to you so you can really be looking at the model instead of read the text and then look over here and go back and forth. So having your information come orally rather than visually, which says there's a lot of work to be done there.
Hi, this is Matt. I understood the first part of the Q&A, so excuse me for where I'm going with this. I wanted to change tracks a little bit and ask a little about the collaboration, the form of collaboration you talked about, and if you see that as an alternate to the traditional peer review that maybe challenges some of the way things are done in the
At my institution, the people who are on the review committees are like the apotheosis level of, they're at a certain age where they're not computer savvy right now. They just didn't live through that. So I think part of that will change over time when people who've grown up with computers are in those positions. But that's only one issue. How do we evaluate a model? Who does this evaluation? Only a handful of journals do reviews, and they usually do like one digital review every 3rd issue or something. They don't have that kind of vetting, which means the critical aspects don't get analyzed. So there are models where you have no idea if they're really accurate or what, because nobody's providing you with that filter. And I think we need a lot more curation of what's produced and evaluation. And frankly, these change so often. You have to say, this was evaluated on this date, because 2 weeks later it may have something else changed on it. It's a big problem. I had a colleague who didn't get his promotion because they said his digital work was for students. You know, digital work is just pretty pictures. It's for the lay public. It's not for scholars. And he spent 10 years doing the research on this. It's under protest at the moment.
That was a question. You said you're visualizing statues. We hope to get young scholars involved. Did you? Because I find in art history, a lot of people read the book or the article for tenure, and they don't want to get involved in the digital realm for very similar reasons. And so they tend to avoid it. And I'm wondering if you're getting young people involved.
And they're told not to do it until they get tenure by their colleagues, their senior colleagues. And it's a fight. We are really fighting that and having a meeting next week about it again.
Did you get an age range instead then?
Well, age range of the people or the...
Yeah, the people who participate.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to argue, is that we're creating a list of people who are digital savvy who could then be on these committees, because a humanist might be reviewed by a neurobiologist or someone who doesn't understand the issues in making the model of something where you have very fragmentary information. And so there's really a disjunction between understanding the picture and the model. So it's an uphill battle where we have on one side the chancellor saying, we want digital humanities, and then when you do it, you say, well, you're not going to get promoted for that. So we have to come together. It's a fight.
Anyone who hasn't?
Is there any communication at all with areas that are doing this outside the academic community, like the gaming world, where you can walk through entire city, multiple cityscapes, walk, fly, climb, and places like National Geographic, which produce television shows for a very large audience, and I don't know the level of their academic accuracy, but they're doing some of this stuff. Universities
Yeah.
have any contact with this?
We have worked with National Geographic. We've worked with the film industry, and we've worked with gaming. Those all have very different agendas. Gaming uses all proprietary software. You have to practically sign away your firstborn before you even go in the office to show them anything or look at anything. And they don't want to share that because that's where the money is for them. So, and they are also about selling it. So there's a disconnect between what we want to do. And every time we work with the film industry, you know, they have a story to tell, and it's about the story. It's not about the product. Just last week, a couple of weeks ago, somebody from a game show called me up and said, "Can you squinch an arch?" And I said, "No, squinch is not a verb. It's a piece of art." You know, I went into the scholarly thing. It's not a verb. And they said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yeah, you cannot squinch an arch." And they said, "Well, we're going to use it anyway because it sounds sexy. Bye." And, you know, then they write, consulted, you know, historical consultant at UCLA. So, and that's just the typical kind of thing that happens, is they want accuracy until it gets in the way. And with gaming, that happens a lot. National Geographic tries to be more historical and more accurate, and they do a lot, but they usually often buy the models from a university.
performance of the model of Santiago de Compostela.
Yeah.
That exists. So did you create from the existing piece? Part one. Part two, do you intend to do more of those? That idea of performance sounds fantastic.
It exists, but we were showing it in the 12th century. So it was quite a bit different, as you can imagine, and we're continuing to model, trying to get the village around it to give it more of a context. We are hoping to do more with performance. I'd love to see Julius Caesar in the Roman Forum, for example. So we are trying to do that, but it's just time to find people. We're really focusing on processions now and trying to think of ways to show triumphal parades and funeral parades and so forth to get that kind of animation through a space where we have more documentation. But, for example, I have my students say, I'll say, you're a slave, you're a emperor, you're a praetorian. Where would you go and where would you be in the forum? And then they have to model their paths of where they could go, where they would be, and so on. So to get them thinking about the space and acting in it.